Continuing Cicero from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Not long after this, Catiline's soldiers got together in a body in Etruria and began to form themselves into companies. The day appointed for the design being near at hand, about midnight, some of the principal and most powerful citizens of Rome, Marcus Crassus, Marcus Marcellus, and Scipio Metellus, went to Cicero's house, where, knocking at the gate and calling up the porter, they commanded him to awaken Cicero and tell him they were there. The business was this: Crassus's porter, after supper, had delivered to him letters brought by an unknown person. Some of them were directed to others, but one to Crassus, without a name. This only Crassus read, which informed him that there was a great slaughter intended by Catiline, and they advised him to leave the city. The others he did not open, but went with them immediately to Cicero, being affrighted at the danger, and to free himself of the suspicion he lay under for his familiarity with Catiline. Cicero, considering the matter, summoned the Senate at the break of the day. The letters he brought with him, and delivered them to those to whom they were directed, commanding them to read them publicly. They all alike contained an account of the conspiracy, and when Quintus Arius, a man of praetorian dignity, recounted to them how soldiers were collecting in companies in Etruria, and Manlius, stated to be in motion with a large force, hovering about those cities, in expectation of intelligence from Rome, the Senate made a decree to place all in the hands of the consuls, who should undertake the conduct of everything and do their best to save the state. This was not a common thing, but only done by the Senate in case of imminent danger. After Cicero had received this power, he committed all affairs outside to Quintus Metellus, but the management of the city he kept in his own hands. Such a numerous attendants guarded him every day when he went abroad, that the greatest part of the marketplace was filled with his train when he entered it. Catiline, impatient of further delay, resolved himself to break forth and go to Manlius, but he commanded Marcius and Cethegus to take their swords and go early in the morning to Cicero's gates, as if only intending to salute him, and then to fall upon him and slay him. This, a noble lady, Fulvia, coming by night, discovered to Cicero, bidding him beware of Cethegus and Marcius. They came by break of day, and being denied entrance, made an outcry and disturbance at the gates, which excited all the more suspicion. But Cicero, going forth, summoned the Senate in the temple of Jupiter Stator, which stands at the end of the sacred street. Is that a misspelling? Is it just Sator? Going up to the Palatine, when Catiline with others of his party also came, as intending to make his defense. None of the senators would sit by him, but all of them left the bench where he had placed himself, and when he began to speak, they interrupted him with outcries. At length Cicero, standing up, commanded him to leave the city. For since one governed the commonwealth with words, the other with arms, it was necessary there should be a wall betwixt them. Catiline, therefore, immediately left the town with 300 armed men, and assuming as if he had been a magistrate, the rods, axes, and military ensigns, he went to Menlius, and having got together a body of nearly 20,000 men, with these he marched to the several cities, endeavoring to persuade or force them to revolt. So it being now come to open war, Antonius was sent forth to fight him. The remainder of those in the city whom he had corrupted, Cornelius and Tullus kept together and encouraged. He had the surname Sura, and was a man of a noble family, but a dissolute liver, for who for his debauchery was formerly turned out of the Senate. I don't know if that you had to be worse back then or worse now. You have people committing A-class felonies that maintain their government positions. We have a president that has attacked women and been inappropriate with children, and we're like, no one's thinking of, prosecuting him for that. Although statute of limitations with most of it, but we definitely hear it could be pretty bad. So what length would he have had to gone to have been kicked out because this guy's too much of a perv, and was now holding the office of praetor for the second time. Just to wash my feet before coming in here, so office of praetor for the second time, as the custom is with those who desire to regain the dignity of senator. It is said that he got the surname Sura upon this occasion, being quaestor at the time of Sulla, and he lavished away and consumed a great quantity of the public money. At which Sulla, being provoked, called him to give an account in the Senate. He appeared with great coolness and contempt, and said he had no account to give, but they might take this, holding up a calf of his leg, as boys do at ball, and when they have missed, upon which he was surnamed Sura, Sura being a Roman word for the calf of the leg, being at another time prosecuted at law, and having bribed some of the judges, he escaped only by 2 votes, and complained of the needless expense he had gone to in paying for a second, as one would have sufficed to acquit him. This man, in such in his own nature, and now inflamed by Catiline, false prophets, and fortune tellers, had also corrupted with vain hopes, quoting to him fictitious verses and oracles, and proving from the Sibylline prophecies that there were 3 of the name Cornelius, designed by fate to be monarchs of Rome, 2 of whom, Cinna and Sulla, had already fulfilled the decree, and that divine fortune was now advancing with the gift of monarchy for the remaining 3rd, Cornelius, and that therefore he ought by all means to accept it, and not lose opportunity by delay, as Catiline had done. Lentulus, therefore, designed no mean or trivial matter, for he had resolved to kill the whole Senate, and as many other citizens as he could, to fire the city and spare nobody, except only Pompey's children. No, why not everybody's children? Well, unless they're grown up or whatever, but intending to seize and keep them as pledges of his reconciliation with Pompey, for there was then a common and a strong report that Pompey was on his way homeward from his great expedition. The night appointed for the design was one of the Saturnalia. I forget exactly what days they are. Before Mithra's day, and the day that Christians decided for Christmas, like a week earlier, something like that, a Saturnalia. Swords, flax, and sulfur they carried and hid in the houses of Cethacus, and providing 100 men, and dividing the city into many parts, they had allotted to every one singly his proper place, so that in a moment, many kindling the fire, the city might be in a flame altogether. Others were appointed to stop up the aqueducts, and to kill those who should endeavor to carry water, to put it out. Whilst these plans were preparing, it happened there were 2 ambassadors from the Allobroges staying at Rome, a nation at that time in a distressed condition and very uneasy under Roman government. These Lentulus and his party, judging useful instruments to move and seduce Gaul to revolt, admitted into the conspiracy, and they gave them letters to their own magistrates and letters to Catiline. In those they promised liberty. In these they exhorted Catiline to set all slaves free, and to bring them along with him to Rome. They sent also to accompany them to Catiline one Titus, a native of Croton, who was to carry those letters to him. These consuls of inconsidering men, who conversed together over wine and with women, Cicero watched with sober industry and forethought, and with most admirable sagacity, having several emissaries abroad, who observed and traced with him all that was done, and keeping also a secret correspondence with many who pretended to join the company, he thus knew all the discourse which passed betwixt them and the strangers, and lying in wait for them by night, he took the Crotonian with his letters, the ambassadors of the Allobroges, acting secretly in concert with him. By break of day he summoned the Senate into the temple of the Concord, where he read the letters and examined the informers. Janius Silanus further stated that several persons had heard Cethacus say that 3 consuls and 4 praetors were to be slain. Piso also was a person of consular dignity, testified other matters of the like nature, and Caius Sulpicius, one of the praetors, being sent to Cethagus's house, found there a quantity of darts and of armor, and a still greater number of swords and daggers, all recently whetted. At length, the Senate decreeing indemnity to the Crotonian upon the confession of the whole matter, Lentulus was convicted, abjured his office, for he was then praetor, and put off his robe edged with purple in the Senate, changing it for another garment more agreeable to his present circumstances. He thereupon, with the rest of his confederates present, was committed to the charge of the praetors in free custody. It being evening, and the common people in crowds expecting without, Cicero went forth to them, and told them what was done, and then, attended by them, went to the house of a friend and near neighbor, for his own was taken up by the women who were celebrating with secret rites the feast of who the Romans called the goddess of good, and the Greeks the women's goddess, for a sacrifice is annually performed to her in the consul's house, either by his wife or mother, in the presence of the Vestal virgins. And having got into his friend's house privately, a few only being present, he began to deliberate how he should treat these men. The severest and the only punishment fit for such heinous crimes he was somewhat shy and fearful of inflicting, as well from the clemency of his nature, as also he should be thought to exercise his authority too insolently, and to treat too harshly men of the noblest birth and most powerful friendships in the city. And yet, if he should use them more mildly, he had a dreadful prospect of danger from them, for there was no likelihood, if they suffered less than death, they would be reconciled, but rather adding new rage to their former wickedness. Well, regardless of which emotion you attach to it, don't think it matters. All these people, when they're silly, it's okay if you figure out how to put love with it. It's like, then you you love everything then. Everything you can justify. So it means nothing. Same thing with anger or hate or whatever. It's not, they would they would rush into every kind of audacity, while he himself, whose character for courage already did not stand very high with the multitude, would be thought guilty of the greatest cowardice and want of manliness, whilst Cicero was doubting what course to take. A portent happened to the women in their sacrificing, for on the altar, where the fire seemed wholly extinguished, a great and bright flame issued forth from the ashes of the burnt wood, at which others were affrighted, but the holy virgins called to Terentia, Cicero's wife, and bade her haste to her husband, and commanded him to execute what he had resolved for the good of his country. For this female entity had sent a great light to the increase of his safety and glory. Sometimes people experience a psychic or a spiritual light that they witness. Terentia, therefore, as she was otherwise in her own nature neither tender-hearted nor timorous, but a woman eager for distinction, who, as Cicero himself says, would rather thrust himself into the public affairs than communicate her domestic matters to him, told him these things and excited him against the conspirators. So also did Quintus his brother, and Publius Nigidius, one of his philosophical friends, whom he often made use of in his greatest and most weighty affairs of state. The next day, a debate arising in the Senate about the punishment of the men, Silanus, being the first who was asked his opinion, said it was fit they should be all sent to the prison, and there suffer the utmost penalty. To him all consented in order, till it came to Caius Caesar, who was afterwards dictator. He was then but a young man, and only at the outset of his career, but had already directed his hopes and policy to that course which he afterwards changed the Roman state into monarchy. Of this others foresaw nothing, but Cicero had seen reason for strong suspicion, though without obtaining any sufficient means of proof, and there were some indeed that said that he was very near being discovered, and only just escaped him. Others are of opinion that Cicero voluntarily overlooked and neglected the evidence against him, for fear of his friends and power, for it was very evident to everybody that if Caesar was to be accused with the conspirators, they were more likely to be saved with him than he to be punished with them. When therefore it came to Caesar's turn to give his opinion, he stood up and proposed that the conspirators should not be put to death, but as their estates confiscated, and their persons confined in such cities in Italy as Cicero should approve, there to be kept in custody till Catiline was conquered. To this sentence, as it was the most moderate, and he that delivered it a most powerful speaker, Cicero himself gave no small weight, for he stood up, and turning the scale on either side, spoke in favor, partly of the former, partly of Caesar's sentence, and all Cicero's friends, judging Caesar's sentence most expedient for Cicero, because he would incur the less blame if the conspirators were not put to death, chose rather the latter, so that Silanus, also changing his mind, retracted his opinion, and said he had not declared for capital, but only the utmost punishment, which, to a Roman senator, is imprisonment. The first man who spoke against Caesar's motion was Catullus Latatius. Cato followed, and so vehemently urged in his speech the strong suspicion against Caesar himself, and so filled the Senate with anger and resolution that a decree was passed for the execution of the conspirators, but Caesar opposed the confiscation of their goods, not thinking it fair that those who rejected the mildest part of his sentence should avail themselves of the severest. And when many insisted upon it, he appealed to the tribunes, but they would do nothing, till Cicero himself, yielding, remitted that part of the sentence. After this, Cicero went out with the Senate to the conspirators. They were not all together in one place, but the several praetors had them, some one, some another, in custody. And first he took Lentulus from the Palatine, and brought him by the sacred street through the middle of the marketplace, a circle of the most eminent citizens, encompassing and protecting him. The people, frightened at what he was doing, passed along in silence, especially the young men, as if with fear and trembling they were undergoing a rite of initiation into some ancient sacred mysteries of aristocratic power. Thus, passing from the marketplace and coming to the Gaol, he delivered Lentulus to the officer. Do they mean goal as in OAL? Or is that delivered? I'm not thinking at the moment. And commanded him to execute him, and after him Cathagus. And so all the rest in order he brought and delivered up to execution. And when he saw many of the conspirators in the marketplace still standing together in companies, ignorant of what was done, and waiting for the night, supposing the men were still alive and in a possibility of being rescued, he called out in a loud voice and said, they did live. For so the Romans, to avoid inauspicious language, name those that are dead. It was now evening when he returned from the marketplace to his own house, the citizens no longer attending him with silence, nor in order, but receiving him as he passed with acclamations and applauses, and saluting him as the savior and founder of his country. A bright light shone through the streets from the lamps and torches set up at the doors, and women showed lights from the tops of the houses to honor Cicero and to behold him returning home with a splendid train of the most principal citizens, amongst whom were many who had conducted great wars, celebrated triumphs, and added to the possessions of the Roman Empire, both by sea and land. These, as they passed along with him, acknowledged to one another that, though the Roman people were indebted to several officers and commanders of that age for riches and spoils and power, yet to Cicero alone they owed the safety and security of all these, for delivering them from so great and imminent a danger. For though it might seem to be no wonderful thing to present the design and punish the conspirators, yet to defeat the greatest of all conspiracies with so little disturbance, trouble, and commotion was very extraordinary. For the greater part of those who had flocked into Catiline, as soon as they heard the fate of Lentulus and Cathagus, left and forsook him. For he himself, with his remaining forces, joining battle with Antonius, was destroyed with his army, and yet there were some who were very ready both to speak ill of Cicero and to do him hurt for these actions, and they had for their leaders some of the magistrates of the ensuing year, as Cicero, who was one of the praetors, and Metellus, and Bestia, the tribunes, these entering upon their office for some few days before Cicero's consulate expired, would not permit him to make any address to the people, but throwing the benches before the rostra, hindered his speaking, telling him he might, if he pleased, make the oath of withdrawal from office, and then come down again. Cicero, accordingly accepting the conditions, came forward to make his withdrawal, and, silence being made, he recited his oath, not in the usual, but in a new and peculiar form, namely, that he had saved his country and preserved the empire, the truth of which oath all the people confirmed with theirs, Cicero and the tribunes, all the more exasperated by this, endeavored to create him further trouble, and for this purpose proposed a law for calling Pompey home with his army, to put an end to Cicero's usurpation. But it was a very great advantage for Cicero and the whole commonwealth that Cato was at that time one of the tribunes, for he, being of equal power with the rest and of great reputation, could oppose their designs. He could easily defeat their other projects, and in an oration to the people so highly extolled Cicero's consulate, and the greatest honors were decreed him, and he was publicly declared the father of his country, which title he seems to have obtained, the first man who did so, when Cato gave it to him in this address to the people. At this time, therefore, his authority was very great in the city, but he created himself very much envy, and offended very many, not by any evil action, but because he was always lauding and magnifying himself, for neither senate nor assembly of the people nor court of Cicero could meet, in which he was not heard to talk of Catiline and Lentulus. Indeed, he also filled his books and writings with his own praises, to such an excess as to render a style in itself most pleasant and delightful, nauseous and irksome to his hearers. This ungrateful humor, like a disease, always cleaving to him, nevertheless, though he was intemperately fond of his own glory, he was very free from envying others, and was, on the contrary, most liberally profuse in commending both the ancients and his contemporaries, as anyone may see in his writings, and many such sayings of his are also remembered, as that he called Aristotle a river of flowing gold, and said of Plato's dialogues, that if Jupiter were to speak, it would be in a language like theirs. He used to call Theophrastus his special luxury, and being asked which of Demosthenes' orations he liked best, he answered the longest, and yet some affected imitators of Demosthenes have complained of some words that occur in one of his letters, to that effect that Demosthenes sometimes falls asleep in his speeches, forgetting the many high encomiums he continually passed upon him, and the compliment he paid him when he named the most elaborate of all his orations those he wrote against Antony Philippus. And as for the eminent men of his own time, either in eloquence or philosophy, there was not one of them whom he did not, by writing or speaking favorably of him, render more illustrious. He obtained of Cicero, when in power, the Roman citizenship for Cratippus, the peripatetic, and got the court of Areopagus by public decree, to request his stay at Athens, for the instruction of their youth and the honor of their city. That's one of the things, obviously, too, is that the the honor lies in the youth of the city. Well, I mean, the youth continue the honor anyways. Your own honor is your own honor. There are letters extant from Cicero to Herodes, and others to his son, in which he recommends the study of philosophy under Cratippus. There is one in which he blames Gorgias, the rhetorician, for enticing his son into luxury and drinking, and therefore forbids him his company. And this, and one other to Pelops, the Byzantine, are the only two of his Greek epistles which seem to be written in anger. In the first, he justly reflects on Gorgias if he were what he was thought to be, a dissolute and profligate character, but in the other he rather meanly expostulates and complains with Pelops for neglecting to procure him a decree of certain honors from the Byzantines. Another illustration of his love of praise is the way in which sometimes, to make his orations more striking, he neglected decorum and dignity. When Manatius, who had escaped conviction by his efficacy, immediately prosecuted his friend Sabinus, he said in the warmth of his resentment, "Do you suppose you were acquitted for your own merits, Manatius, and was it not that I so darkened the case that the court could not see your guilt, when from the rostra he had made a eulogy on Marcus Crassus with such applause, and within a few days after again publicly reproached him? Crassus called to him